These efforts did produce more tax revenues, but the black market in pirated and smuggled goods continued to expand. Moreover, the public proved highly resistant to the government's effort to delegitimize freebooters, wreckers, smugglers, and contraband traders. These traders were regarded as both conventional and economically helpful to local economies, and also to the imperial economy. By contrast, the notion that landed governments had the jurisdiction and authority to disallow certain commercial practices at sea, that was regarded as unconventional and novel, as well as economically injurious. Even though the campaign against illegal trade failed to convince locals to shun pirates and smuggled goods, it reveals a recognition on the part of imperial officials that a campaign against illegal trade required a public relations campaign against the commercial, legal, and moral beliefs of consumers and merchants and office holders. Simply outlawing certain practice by statute was not achieving the desired result. The fact that anti-piracy and anti-smuggling laws were reissued regularly and with escalating rhetorical ferocity indicates governmental frustration over continued practices. These numerous laws and regulations should not be construed as reflecting new commercial practices at sea. Okay. This observation is a methodological critique offered by legal and cultural historians when addressing piracy specialists like Rediker. Okay. These legal and cultural scholars point out that modern observers, including historians, have a natural tendency to project onto the 18th century the jurisprudence, sensibilities, and logic of the modern nation state. Basically, modern accounts of modern histories of piracy tend to read early modern statutes, royal proclamations, and parliamentary rhetoric as credible indications of reality on board ships, in port towns, and in local government bureaucracies. If a similar approach were adopted to study our own society, one might conclude that the government has curbed a host of social ills that in actuality it has been impotent to delegitimize, let alone control. Take drug use, underage drinking, for example. Okay? So anti-piracy and anti-smuggling statutes and in official records can give us a false impression of actual commercial practices and conventions. As important, they don't reveal that they represent only one side of an ideological contest, nor do they reveal the degree to which the central government's understanding of the state was challenged or merely ignored locally. So what I suggest is that we should see here two opposing legal belief systems. Okay? English custom accommodated the practice of tax evasion and violent seizure at sea, while English law, or statutory law that is, increasingly sought to regulate and eventually abolish these. When scholars discuss freebooting and smuggling using the language of crime, they validate 18th century state rhetoric and ideology, even though all contemporary accounts, official and unofficial, report that British communities did not consider these trades to be criminal, illegitimate, or disreputable. If you examine our own register of statutes and regulations, state or federal, you'll find many laws and regulations that list as crimes activities that people do daily. Okay? For example, in some jurisdictions, throwing snowballs at people is considered assault. Okay? The people who live there know that snowball fights are technically illegal on paper, or that kids are not allowed to have lemonade stands without a commercial permit from the city. But we live in this society, so through daily life, we get the message that throwing a snowball and selling lemonade are not really crimes. Okay? After all, nobody you know observes these laws, and lawbreakers are not thought of as criminals by their neighbors, by the cops, or by the government. So if I wrote a book about crime in America, I would be misleading my readers if I did not include this cultural context of daily life when I discuss many laws that are on the books. By telling my readers that the ancient legal practice of kids selling lemonade on the street is a crime, I'm asking them to accept as established law what we know is a legal novelty that is hotly contested. So if I wrote that book, I'd be laughed at or dismissed by readers. But readers 300 years from now might very well believe me. In their world, maybe kids really don't have lemonade stands and snowball fights because neighbors complain about it and the cops arrest them for it. Okay? So my future readers might actually believe that these laws that we have on the books today are legit. If I exposed these readers from the future only to the statutory law, they would have a skewed and incorrect view of how life was lived locally in the early 21st century. And privateering is a good example of how misleading statutory law can be in this respect. New governmental regulations in the early 18th century indicate to some scholars that privateering had become a well-regulated business from the initial license to the final decree in prize court. And indeed, privateering commissions articulated the precise boundaries of legitimate commerce rating, outlining national government's view of the legal and ethical line separating pirate from privateer. These privateering commissions, offer lengthy and detailed legal procedures of capturing prizes, bringing them to port, and claiming title to them in court. Other acts and regulations provided exhaustive elucidations on the terms and restrictions binding privateers, supplemented by copious explanations of prize procedures, outlining procedures for processing prize claims, addressing the protests of aggrieved shipmasters or proprietors, assessing competing claims, and so forth. Okay. Privateer owners borrowed this legal boilerplate in their instructions to ship captains. Okay. An admiralty court applied such laws, regulations, and proclamations to actual cases brought before them. So these early modern sources point to the existence of a robust body of legal and bureaucratic provisions that purported to regulate privateering. Okay. Now, while historians of piracy acknowledge, in passing, that such regulations were not effective at actually regulating the trade, they nevertheless present the dividing line between pirate and privateer as a real thing. In treating statutes and royal proclamations and parliamentary rhetoric as reliable reflections of actual practices at sea, they give credence to parliamentary and court presumptions of authority, jurisdiction, and effectiveness on the peripheries of the British state. Even though all modern scholars and early modern observers acknowledge that it was impossible to keep privateers within the bounds of legal conduct and to prevent them from broadening their operations into open piracy. Okay. Contemporaries in the 17th and 18th centuries, as products of a pre-modern state, intuitively accepted as a practical and ethical reality the murkiness and irrelevance of these legal categories, pirate and privateer, which were handed down to them by Parliament. Okay. So whereas state authorization for commerce rating matters a great deal to modern scholars, it was a relatively hollow concept in a society that did not recognize that the state had the jurisdiction, the legal authority, and the moral legitimacy to allow or disallow armed commerce. In the book, I quote a 1795 scholarly study by Georg Friedrich de Martens on the laws governing privateering. And de Martens points out that laws regulating privateering were ill-observed and that privateers exceeded their legal bounds as a matter of course. Okay? And he reminds his law students that the laws give an idea of order and justice at sea in the same manner as portraits give an idea of persons who are not really there. Okay? And this observation is a salient reminder to modern readers that even in the late 18th century, prize law was a facade, creating in our minds an image of order which contemporary merchants, sailors, consumers, and officials did not see. So while the line dividing pirate from privateer was legally valid according to statutory law, it was culturally untrue, and according to common law, also legally dubious. Okay? What I suggest is that we should regard statutory law on these matters not as law, like the law that dictates that we drive on the right side of the road, but as a form of propaganda of state building. It failed in the 18th century to wash away constituents' attachment to local custom, common law, and local governance. But it was successful eventually in the 19th and especially the 20th centuries. And for us historians, the statutory law creates an illusion of order that is real and sensible to us, but was not real and not sensible to contemporaries. Legal historians of crime tell us that the strict and clear language of the criminal law cannot be taken as evidence of its application in practice. Nor should it suggest to us popular acquiescence to the law or public acceptance of the central government's presumption to dictate standards of criminality. These scholars point out that the law, as enacted by Parliament and understood by the court, differed from the legal beliefs as well as the informed legal opinion of wide segments of British society. Statutory law was a tool for implementing and explaining the doctrine of centralized governance that was forming in governmental circles in London in the mid-18th century. Okay? These are the doctrines of parliamentary supremacy and imperial parliamentary jurisdiction that you've read about. This is why the court went to the trouble of publishing and disseminating the proceedings of piracy trials. These publications were to educate the public about what is legal and illegal according to Parliament and the King. But by the same token, the ease and security with which merchants, sailors, and their collaborators got around the statutory law educated the public in the real world that the statutory law was superseded by an older, more traditional understanding of law, of state, and of the boundary between central and local authority. For example, the English state had claimed sovereignty in the British seas since the late 14th century. So successive generations of Englishmen were born, lived, and died with the recognition that although the court claimed to have authority to outlaw various practices and trades at sea, the sea was in fact free from governmental control and jurisdiction. Laws that condemned freebooting and upheld state jurisdiction at sea were very old, as was the widespread practical experience of the state's de facto impotence at sea. Commerce as practiced sent British constituents a stronger, a signal that was stronger than any statute of the civil law as to what business practices were legal, customary, and acceptable. And in a political culture that did not codify state authority and jurisdiction, common practice and common law were the primary guides as to what was legal and constitutional.